3, 2, 1. This is The Jungle, an up-close, unvarnished look inside leadership and business strategy. We wade into the real-world leader's face and explore what they do to create a path forward, because that's what business is. Wild, exciting, it's The Jungle.
Derek, where are we?
Would this be the in-person jungle, Doug? Is that what we call it? So we're at our space. We're at our new space. Downtown Kalamazoo. It's fantastic being downtown Kalamazoo, but it's our new space for our center and Sleepy Giant Capital and for our operations, and it's fantastic.
It's kind of amazing to see the place now redone. Shout out to CSM Group and Catalyst Development and Tower Pinkster, who has helped out. Hayworth Furniture that we're sitting in is amazing. Excited to bring, we've had students down here. We've had executives down, downtown Kalamazoo. We've had our podcast guest, our first podcast guest. So great to bring students here downtown. I don't know if this will be our podcast setup for the future, but they get to see this lovely lounge space, which is great. Yes. But it's exciting to see what we can now do with this space to impact students, impact the community. Our business, our accelerator for the acquisition program, where people can search for companies here. Lots of possibilities.
Yeah, it's obviously Hayworth and the furniture, space can transform the way you work, the way you collaborate, if it's designed properly, and you really feel the different flow of my life with the new space. Yeah. What I'm doing, how I'm doing it, how I'm interacting with students, how I'm interacting with individuals. We're trying to change the way we teach because the tiered lectures classroom, those are gone. If you're in a tiered lecture classroom and you're a student, you should be asking, why am I sitting here? Yeah. Right? And if someone's talking at you, you should be asking, and this allows us to do everything differently, which is kind of nice. So it's great to be in the space, Doug. Yeah. We keep pushing boundaries on everything, and I think the space is the next boundary pushed. And we're going to keep doing it and keep innovating because it's just who we are.
Yep. So exciting, someone who's breaking the mold was our great
guest, talking about innovating and doing things differently. Yeah.
Yep. So we had Irshad Manji, who has
you got it right. Good job.
Irshad Manji, Ugandan-born Canadian educator, author of a number of books, but the book that she's really
Yay
Canada is her book Don't Label Me, and she's also the founder of the Moral Courage Project. And she has a really great approach to thinking about diversity, about how you create a culture of inclusion, a lot of topics that business leaders are really interested in. And she wonderfully and graciously came to Western Michigan University as part of the We Talk program, which is really focused on conversations in divided times, how you create those conversations, overcome division. And so she had a great visit. She's meeting with students over at Western as part of that series. We've got a little bit piece of that. We talk programming, our moving conversations exercise. So it's something we care a lot about, is how you create community connection across differences, and something that we're interested in learning more about and seeing different viewpoints. So it was great to have her join us. I mean, she's, you look her up online on YouTube and you see a bunch of videos, and check out her book, read her book. It's great. I read it over the last week. What was your takeaway from our conversation?
Yeah, so we talked about how hard this intro would be because she's done so much. She's now at Oxford launching some programs, but just how difficult it is to introduce her because her work is threading through society. Right? Whether it's work, universities, unable to have discourse at universities, on the job, within your communities, whether that be church or sports teams, it's just her work is going through everything right now. And my takeaway was just like the failed approach to so many of DEI. Organizations get this wrong. You hear from employees when you talk to them informally outside organizations, they hate the way the organizations are doing it. Universities are doing it wrong. Everyone's approaching this the wrong way. And I give them credit for trying to approach it because it's a really hard subject. But her approach is very different than what most organizations are doing. And she's trying to get us to approach DEI from a different perspective. You talk about dishonest diversity versus just diversity. You talk about moral courage and what that means, and opening safe spaces and developing trust and listening and understanding that you're more than just a label. right? Let's look at everybody for their whole, not just their pieces, and have all these diversity numbers. Like we need an N of X to make sure we're diverse, which makes no sense. So I really appreciate the way she approaches things. I like this approach in general for communities, organizations, people, leaders, right? Creating spaces. She gave a lot of talk about leaders. So it's a really interesting approach, and so many DEI things, you just go through them, you're like, that was not right, I don't feel right about it. This, I had a really just good overall feeling about it, right? Mm-hmm. This is how you approach conversations as a leader. Not feeling stupid, not feeling scared to approach those difficult conversations. How to do that, I think was a really good approach. So I'll go with her overall. I don't know, it's not anti-DEI, but it's like different approach to DEI. I think could be very revolutionary and drive a lot of change if adopted. So what was your takeaway? So
it's something interesting we talk about in our academic jobs, and in terms of institutional theory, things, you see banks look like banks and grocery stores look like grocery stores, and organizations become similar. They adopt things similarly, and they do so because other people are adopting them. And if you look at some of the research, Adam Grant had a great post about this, and some folks at Harvard. A lot of the research around the effectiveness of current DEI approaches is the evidence is just not there. So I think, it would be interesting I don't know what the evidence, is in terms of her approach. Maybe that yields a better result. But I know that, from what the existing research shows, that we need more productive ways of doing this, because this is important.
Yeah, it's surface level. It's the least something we should try.
Yes.
Current DEI practice is not working. Surface level, this feels like something we should try. Whether it works or not, we got to see.
Yep.
So your takeaway?
So my takeaway, I think what I really like about her, she has a lot of different tactical implementations that she does with companies. The underlying thesis, though, to me, the underlying mechanism of her approach is this lowering of emotional defenses, and how you get there through sincere questions, through building trust. She had some really nice takeaways here in the podcast of how you actually start those conversations and build that trust. But this is the starting point that I've kind of, it resonates with me in the moving conversation work that we've done, is unless you build that connection first, and you build that sense of trust, of warmth, it's when the emotions go crazy, you have unproductive conversations. And so I like that her approach really starts from that, lowering the emotional defenses so you can have a civil conversation. And I really liked kind of building off of that. And when she said, we might have a disagreement, but we are more than our disagreement. I'm not going to take that disagreement and cast you out as a person just because we disagree on this one thing. So lots of great nuggets. We covered a lot of territory.
Yeah, and your takeaway feeds into everything. Setting that tone, building you mentioned the container, right? Let's have a container for the conversation. In this container, you lower the emotional defenses, you set the tone, you're sincere, authentic, you're asking questions, you're interested. Yeah, so very good. So
and wanting to learn. Yeah. So great first podcast. We hope everybody first live podcast.
It's probably episode 50 plus or something by now.
That's true.
But first great live
in
podcast, person at our new space, downtown Kalamazoo. Come see us.
Yep. We hope
book a meeting. Don't just pop in.
That's true. So we hope everybody enjoys our conversation with Irshad Manji.
The Jungle is produced by the Center for Principled Leadership and Business Strategy in Western Michigan University's Hayworth College of Business. Our center supports the leadership and business strategy major, conducts large-scale consulting projects, and trains professionals in acquiring and operating small businesses. To learn more, visit wmich.edu/leadership center.
Irshad Manji, welcome to the Jungle. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yes, cheers.
Cheers.
Excellent. Sorry that there's no clink, but
that's okay. That's okay. So Derek, what are you?
It's an in-person cheers, Doug. It's an in-person cheers we got to do. Exciting, right?
The first
Something's Brewing coffee right downstairs from our new space. So Shout out to them. But in-person cheers.
Something Brewing around the corner is it's a great little coffee shop in Kalamazoo. First podcast in person. in the new space. Knock on wood.
Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And a fantastic guest.
That's right.
Right. What a person.
What else are you going to say? You're going to call me an awful guest, a ridiculous guest? Come on. At the very beginning?
At the very beginning, right? That would be tough to do.
Well, that wouldn't happen for Derek because he's Canadian.
Yes.
As it turns out, so am I. Yes. Hence my sorry at the beginning of this conversation that there was no clink.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So you've had a great visit so far to Western.
I've so enjoyed Kalamazoo. Western Michigan, honestly, is on the cutting edge of an effort that really needs to be made in this country, including in business, which is reconciling seeming opposites like free speech and social justice, right? We live in a time when so much is steeped in us against them, that kind of framing, including on work teams. And Western's approach is, wait a minute, we don't buy that frame. Actually, you can have two seeming opposites if you take the both and approach rather than the either or approach. And let's face it, business thrives on collaborative teamwork. If we're going to have, approaches to, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion that divide people, not only is there not going to be the kind of spirit of togetherness that any productive team requires, but there's also not going to be innovation, because innovation is not an individual thing. It requires diversity of viewpoint, and it requires people to be able to engage those viewpoints in ways that are inquisitive, not inquisitional. So those are the kinds of things that, honestly, companies are not yet wrapping their heads around when it comes to the latest sort of demands that employees have of their employers. And that is, that kind of us against them sort of antagonism is alive and well, especially in the DEI space. And I'm here to suggest, like Western is teaching, there's a different way, a better way.
So let's talk a little bit about, and we talked about this before, that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about your approach and encourage everybody to read your book. And you've got Don't Label Me.
Don't Label Me is a new book.
And
fantastic.
There's tons of YouTube resources. You've got the Moral Courage Project, and encourage folks to
and come to moralcourage.com, where you can find out, frankly, what my outfit, Moral Courage College, does both with companies and with higher ed. But we're focused on companies here. Yep. So, happy to talk more about that.
So
we're a little blend, though. We're companies and higher ed. So
exactly.
That's true.
You see,
we cut across both.
That is true.
You're both and. You're not either or.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes.
So let's spend. We'll encourage folks to get into the book and go to the website to learn more. But give a high level overview if someone is not acquainted with your work. Yeah. What's your approach to DEI and how do you think about that?
Right. So, in diversity, equity, and inclusion, the work tends to be focused on, even obsessed with, demographics, right? How many black people do we have in the room? How many women? How many queer people? How many people with disabilities? This is actually very divisive. And I say this not as a personal opinion, but from a neuroscientific perspective, because the more you focus on labels, the more you're actually emphasizing what separates people from one another. And if you really want to be effective, both in DEI and in cultivating a productive, innovative team, you want to actually flip the script and say, diversity matters, but inclusion comes first. Meaning that the so-called white straight guys matter as much in this workplace as do the queer Muslims. Okay? And when you understand that inclusion is the foundation of diversity that thrives, then you also realize that within groups, within groups, not just between them, inside of them, we have individuals. I'm a Muslim. I don't think the same way as every other Muslim. And in fact, no other Muslim thinks exactly the same way as every other Muslim. Similarly, if I'm just looking at you and my, primitive brain is labeling the both of you, I'd say, you're white guys. That doesn't mean that you think exactly the same way as each other, right? And so we've got to recognize that individuals are not identical even when they are assigned to the same demographic group. So diversity of viewpoint has to be part and parcel of diversity itself. That is inclusion. That is why the approach that Moral Courage College, my company, takes is really the unifying approach to DEI. We don't shame. We don't label people, no matter what group they're born into. We emphasize diversity of viewpoint as part and parcel of diversity itself, and we don't tell anybody what's okay to think or say or believe. We help everyone think more clearly by reducing emotional defenses on all sides of any given issue.
I like this approach already, Doug, because everyone thinks we're the same, and I think nothing like you.
It's true.
It's the same demographic, same kid.
I mean, he's Canadian, I'm American. I mean, this is
very different individuals, but look, walk, act very similar, but think and approach things at a very different level. So one of the terms I really liked was dishonest diversity. Can you I thought that would be a good way to explain kind of what you're all about. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So once again, this word diversity gets kicked around way too much. We've got to distinguish between what I call dishonest diversity and honest diversity. Dishonest diversity takes individuals and slices us up into compartments, into pieces, and then stuffs us into cubby holes like Muslim, like white, woman, man, and leaves us there as if those are our assigned places. When the reality is, each of us is so much more than meets the eye. You have a unique backstory, as do you, and your backstories differ. So even though you might look alike, even though I might want to label you in the same way, you each have insights and ideas, opinions, and experiences that are your own. And even when you have similar experiences, you will interpret them differently, right? So we've got to appreciate that diversity, if it's going to be meaningful, has to take into account the individuality of each of us. And that is what I call honest diversity.
So this focus around labels is a key theme of your book.
And my work.
And your work. And
and I don't like the focus on labels. Let me be very clear.
Right.
Though I know, by the way, that because of how we human beings are wired, the primitive part of our brain is always looking to make sense of everything in our immediate environment because it's scanning for threats. So I can't help the fact that I will label and you will label. We're all wired in that way. But what I can help is what I do with those labels. If I treat those labels as my finish line, then frankly, I'm not understanding you at all, either of you. But if I treat them as a starting point for further discovery, that is when I can be constructive about the fact that our brains are constantly labeling. So let me be very clear. I don't like labels. I know that they're not going away, so I will use them in a constructive way. And that is as a starting point, not as a finish line. So
let's clarify that for listeners.
Sure.
As humans, we will subconsciously or consciously always label.
Yep.
It comes natural to us. It's a narrative approach to approaching people, and we
approaching anything.
It helps the human understand their surroundings, understand people, so they automatically label. But what you're saying is, okay, recognize that you're labeling,
Yep.
and then you should do something with that label.
Exactly right. And here's the thing, Derek, we say, you and I just now, that our brains will label immediately in order to understand, as you put it, or as I said, to make sense of our immediate environment. But actually, we often misunderstand by caving to those labels, right? So for example, and you've heard this before, especially in the DEI world, white guys have all the power. Look at me. I'm Muslim, I'm a woman, I'm a person of color. I'm triply disadvantaged, the DEI industrial complex tells me. When the reality is that depending on the context, sometimes I actually have more power than either of you. I can get away today with saying certain things that neither one of you would get away with saying, even if it was true, even if you sincerely believed it. So to suggest that as a, quote, white man, Derek, you have more power than I do, those are labels. And I'm caving to those labels if I don't engage you further and if I don't understand that in certain situations, actually, I'm more powerful than you are. You see? So labels sometimes misconstrue what people are, who people are, and how much power they have in a given context.
So the notion of labels and labeling, they're white, they're black, they're straight, they're gay, they're queer, they're all of those.
All of that.
We've had labels, around for a long time. People have, humans humans label naturally. Yet it seems like the labeling and labels as a phenomenon seems to be increasing and becomes more potent. Do you have kind of a sense of why that is now?
Yes. I think that our environment now, and I'll explain what I mean in just a second, is geared to priming the emotional part of our brain to be outraged all the time. We all know social media platforms are deliberately designed to amp up our emotions, right? But there's more than social media. There's also legacy media, traditional media, whose business models are changing. Time was, when I was growing up, that they made most of their money through ads, and ads that tried to appeal to a mass audience. No longer. We're so fragmented as a society that any advertisers in traditional media are now targeting niche audiences and therefore not paying as much for their ads as they used to. So what did media businesses figure out? That there's an additional way to make money, and that is through the subscription-based model. The problem is that as a subscriber, I'm paying not to have my biases challenged. Mm-hmm. I'm paying to have my biases confirmed. And so media companies that operate on a subscription-based model are naturally going to frame most stories to suit my biases. That means that they're going to give me a lopsided picture of reality, regardless of where they are on the ideological or political spectrum. Happens on the left, happens on the right, happens in between. Okay? And finally, so in addition to media, there's one other major environmental factor that the research tells us is huge, and that is what social scientists are calling today political sectarianism. And what that means is, even though organized religion is plummeting in popularity, we as a people are no less religious. Politics is our new religion. In America, that certainly does mean Republican, Democrat, but it also means within those two communities, there are factions that adhere to politics and that demand Puritanism from one another. So within the climate change, the combating climate change movement, there is a certain Puritanism. If you don't agree 100% with what I believe or what the consensus in this group is, you're a heretic. On the right, there is Puritanism within the Trump faction. Later today, I'm going to be speaking with somebody who has been a Republican for 30 years and was ousted as the executive director of the Michigan State Republican Party, simply because he pointed out the obvious publicly, that Trump blew the election. Right? Because of that, the Trump Puritans went after him, and he was gone as the executive director of the state party in only 6 months. So again, politics is the new religion. But let me add one other thing to all of this. These sorts of politics are even worse than organized religion in terms of dogma, because at least organized religion has preached mercy. It has preached grace. There is absolutely no room for redemption, for mercy, for atonement in the politics of secular movements. So all of these things combined are constantly priming that primitive part of the brain that is scanning for threats. And so one thing that I've sort of observed over the last, frankly, number of years is that, and this is getting worse, is that people aren't even waiting to be offended anymore. They are entering into conversations. They think it's conversation, but actually it's monologue. They're entering into conversations being pre-offended. Derek, I already know that you're not going to hear me out. I already know that you're my adversary, that you don't give a damn about me as a person, because to you, I'm evil. Even though you never said that, I already know that about you. So I'm not going to enter this conversation expecting us to actually talk it through. I'm just going to be so extreme, so dogmatic, and so defensive that I am going to out-punch you from the get-go. As a politically obsessed friend of mine likes to say, and this is crazy, but he says this all the time, do unto others before they do unto you.
So let's move into tactical, because that was really good. And I got a good segue to get very tactical. So you work with a lot of companies, and we're a business podcast. So companies are also struggling heavily with this situation right now. So I read a lot of stuff on you. So Chris Rock was a fan, and he said, how does someone that's not intelligent like me about this, so, you know, if you say that, use your power example, right? You probably have power over us, and you can say certain things. So how does someone stupid like me, to use Chris Rock's frame, create a way to have these conversations and not accidentally slip? So I was terrified about this conversation. How do I make sure, you know, I'm scared of slipping or something coming out that wouldn't sound right? Yeah. So how does someone like me, a leader of students and businesses and things like that, and our listeners, progress forward using your model in day-to-day situations? Very tactical.
Super tactical.
Super tactical. How do I'm going into a meeting? What does someone stupid like me do to make sure that we can have these conversations? How's that? Is that the way Chris Rock would say?
It's very humble of you to, you know, call yourself stupid. You are anything but. But I hear what you're saying, because Chris Rock, you know, he endorses my work, and he says that, you know, Irshad Manji believes that even people as stupid as I am, you know, deserve to have a voice, right? So let's get super tactical. First of all, there is a 5-step method that I teach everybody, whether it's in the corporate space, whether it's in education, you know, personal relationships, professional collaborations. And one of the steps in that method is that set the terms of the conversation right away. Create what I call the culture of the conversation right away, Derek. If you're afraid that you're going to say something that will sound offensive or come out the wrong way, say from the very beginning, this conversation might involve some disagreement with you, Irshad. And, you know, I know that you are so much more than any disagreement that we might have, just as I am so much more than the position I take on any given issue. So I'm not going to judge, Derek says to Irshad, I'm not going to judge all of who you are based on any particular position that you take on an issue we're going to talk about. Can we agree that you won't judge all of me on that basis as well, right? Here's the deal. If you are not a narcissist, if you are not a sociopath, you actually want to be heard. You don't like being judged, and especially not by somebody who doesn't know you. So when you offer that courtesy to me, that Irshad, I'm not going to judge all of who you are based on any disagreement we have, you are putting me at ease. I'm going to feel a sense of relief. And so when you say in your next breath, can we agree that you won't judge all of who I am based on, any difference of opinion we have? I'm more than going to be, willing to do that for you, because you've gone first to assure me that you're not going to, this is not a game for you. You're not going to play gotcha with me. You're in this in good faith. So that's one of the steps in creating, again, the culture of the conversation. And notice, by the way, I just want to say one other thing about this, that in going first, in offering that up first, not waiting for me to offer that up, you're actually claiming some power to decide the expectation that you're going to have of me and that I can have of you. So this is something that I teach, frankly, a lot to people of color and others who think that they are part of minority groups, is that when you go first in the listening department, you are by no means compromising or conceding your values, your principles, your ideals. In fact, you are claiming your power to set the tone and the way this conversation is going to go.
So let's move from a conversation to a leader of an organization. And they've read your book, they like the approach, they want to bring this into their organization, weave it into the fabric. What do they do? Do they do a town hall? Do they do a communication? Do they meet individually? Very tactically, where do you start on this journey?
Great. So often where we start is the CEO brings me into her company to speak to as many employees as are interested in these issues, specifically diversity, equity, inclusion, though, of course, that's just a salient frame. What I'm about to say applies to so much more than just that.
To jump in there, would you label should someone label what this is DEI work, or should they label it something different?
Well, it depends on the priorities that they have, right, as a company. For example, I get a lot of communication from C-suite executives who say, we grab the lowest hanging fruit, critical race theory, intersectionality, when the George Floyd thing happened and when the pressure was on to do DEI, right? We just went with whatever everybody else was doing. And you know what, Irshad? It has torn us apart because we focused on demographics and now everybody is at each other's throats. We need a reset. When I get those kinds of calls and emails, that's when I know it deserves to have the frame of DEI. But what I'm really teaching, and I'll get into the tactics in just a second, what I'm really teaching is how do we communicate with one another when there is disagreement, in moments of high emotion and deep division and awkward tension. So you can see that this is not just about DEI. I'll teach you how to have these conversations with your own kids or with your own spouse. If mental health and emotional well-being are core today, and they are, to people being productive and innovative at work, then you can't just compartmentalize these things as purely professional development, right? This is about how you move through your day-to-day life feeling like, of all the things that I can't control in this world, here is what I can control. I can control how I respond when people push my buttons or trigger me in some way, right? Whether they're my spouse or whether they're my coworker.
And I didn't mean to get distracted, but that's really helpful because it sounds like depending on the situation, it could be labeled as a DEI focus, or it could be labeled as a well-being, mental health,
right, exactly.
or professional development,
or leadership development.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that. Okay.
And I just have to emphasize how you label it. As with every other label, treat that label as a starting point, not as a finish line, right? So even if you label it DEI because that is your most urgent priority right now, understand that the tools I'm going to, give you apply to so much more than DEI. Okay, so the first thing that a CEO can do is bring me or one of my mentors in. I train mentors to teach, corporate employees the skills of moral courage, and that's my company, Moral Courage College. The first thing that they can do is bring me or one of the mentors in to talk to employees about the 30,000 feet above the ground sort of perspective on DEI, and our program is called Diversity Without Division. Okay, it's the unifying approach to diversity. So, for example, Derek, one of the first questions that I answer when I do a fireside chat is, Irshad, you distinguish between honest diversity and dishonest diversity. Unpack that for us. What does that mean? Just like you asked me a few minutes ago, right? What is moral courage? Why is it important to a healthy approach to DEI. So we covered the big picture because this is such a counter-cultural approach to diversity and inclusion that people first need to be eased into what this is and why we do it this way. The next step is that I or one of my mentors leads a 90-minute communication workshop in which we give every participant certain tips, techniques, and tools for communicating effectively across disagreements, divisions, and even mutual disgust.
Can you give an example of one of those techniques?
Sure.
Tools,
so remember how just a few
absolutely.
So remember how just a few minutes ago I pointed out that one of the ways you can actually start a conversation if you worry that it's going to become contentious, right? You can start it by saying, I'm not going to judge all of who you are based on this one disagreement we may be having, and I hope that you can afford me that same courtesy. But here's another tip. Don't rush into the conversation telling the other person where you're coming from. First, you'll get that chance, but first, ask them questions about where they're coming from. And here's the key. Ask sincere questions, not gotcha questions. So for example, how does this issue make you feel? That's not taxing their brain. That is starting with the heart. How does it make you feel? Another opening question can be, can you help me understand what I'm missing about where you're coming from? In other words, you're not telling them, I'm here to school you. No, you're taking a much more humble approach. You're saying, I think I have something to learn from you. Help me understand what I'm missing about you. Right? That immediately lowers emotional defenses. And when you lower emotional defenses, the noise that is going on in the other person's head, because of that primitive brain that wants to feel threatened, you get rid of that noise.
Is that your kind of the core mechanism underlying your approach? Is that regulating the emotions of the conversation?
Absolutely. Because you'll recall, and I'll emphasize this, it can't be said enough in my view, that one of the distinguishing features of our approach, diversity without division, is that we don't tell anybody what they're allowed to think, believe, or say. We teach everybody how to think more clearly by lowering those emotional defenses. And that way, they can move from the primitive part of the brain, which is all about emotion, into the more evolved part of the brain, which allows reason and emotion to coexist, rather than emotion bulldozing reason out of the way, right? So the kinds of opening questions that I've just suggested allow the other person to feel this individual, the one I'm in this conversation with, actually cares about me. They're not interested in imposing their point of view on me. They might believe, even after this conversation, that on balance, they're right. But they're going to give me a fair hearing.
You know, it's interesting you say that, and I want to talk about the next step after the communication workshop is we talk about with our students on leadership, of the importance of, I heard this phrase from, shout out to Reverend Sue Phillips who gave this to me, but the importance of being the words. Right. And when you ask those opening questions that you are sincere, people know when you're asking them just to ask them.
Yes.
Versus you asking them because you actually sincerely care.
Absolutely, and that brings us to the next step, which is, now that you've asked what you think is a sincere question, I'm going to ask the two of you, what do you do next? It's not a trick question. You ask a question, what do you do next?
So somebody's asked a question, how do you feel, what am I missing?
Right. And what do you do after that? It's not a trick question. It's the most obvious response. Give it to me.
Listen carefully, and maybe mirror and call what they're saying.
Okay. So Derek, you've nailed it. Listen, and here's the key: listen to understand, not to win. You see, one of the biggest mistakes any of us makes when we feel that there's a stake in a positive outcome, we have a stake in a positive outcome to a conversation, is we're always looking to turn that discussion into a debate. Well, the moment you turn a discussion into a debate, there can only be one winner. And your ego, that primitive part of the brain, will say to you, you, Irshad, will be the winner. I will not let you be the loser. Well, guess what? In a debate, the other person's ego will say the same thing to them. So listening completely goes out the window the moment you turn a discussion into a debate. So I want to just address something here. How do you know then when you're listening sincerely rather than merely strategically? You know that you're not listening when there's something in you, as you're supposedly listening, there's something in you that keeps saying, yeah, but you're not addressing this part of my question, or you're not addressing that part of my question, right? You're always looking to poke holes in the other person's argument. That is not listening, because that is not trying to understand. But you know you are listening when you're curious, when what the other person is saying intrigues you to the point where you actually want to learn more. And you want to learn more. And the key here is want to learn more, because there's no need to win. And there's no need to win because this is a discussion, not a debate.
So Derek's wife is a teacher. My wife works with, pre-kindergarten, young kids. I'm almost thinking that your approach is solving, problems that maybe happen way earlier, where we've lost our ability to be able to do conversations in a relational way.
Right.
And that you are solving it here on the back end, which we need to, but that these skills sound like they matter as much for executives in business as they would for young people.
Which is why Moral Courage College also works a lot in the K-12 education space, right? We're actually now teaching teachers how to teach these skills to middle and high schoolers.
Sorry, I was just as an aside. So, I mean, because it matters. It's so relational as a skill to be able to do that.
That's exactly right.
And
in fact, if you were to ask me, from a social science perspective, Irshad, what field do you work in? What do you teach? I'd say I teach relational leadership.
Is this why most DEI training is failing? And programs?
Absolutely right. Okay. Absolutely right. And study upon study upon study demonstrates that DEI training repeatedly fails because it doesn't take into account how we human beings need to relate to one another in order to build trust. There's a word we haven't said yet, trust, right? And the only way we can discuss our differences constructively is if we first trust one another to not play gotcha with one another.
Yeah. Well, so plug for our moving conversation exercise, which we should talk about at another point, but that's, it starts from that proposition, which is that building of that relationship is so critical before you go to the next, until you go to disagreement or more of these, topics that are a little bit, more emotionally charged, right? And I didn't want, we kind of went on a little bit of a, off-road there, but you had kind of, 5 steps, you were talking about bringing, outsiders in to kind of lay the foundation, the kind of the big picture, communication workshop, and then what happens
after that? Okay, so a number of companies I've worked with have been so impacted by the communication workshop itself that they've then come back and said, we love you, but we don't want to keep hiring you guys to do these communication workshops for our new hires. We want to train a number of employees within our company to lead these communication workshops for our new hires and even for promotional purposes, right? That this becomes part of the criteria we use for what people need to be able to do in order to be promoted. And so we teach then employees how to lead these workshops going forward. And then always.
Is that HR employees? Is that senior leaders? Is that anybody that's
right
willing
across the board.
That wants to get better across the board? Okay.
Exactly right. And again, that's part of their own skill development to be eligible to rise further within the company itself. Now, the next step is there are always a slice of those employees who are now leading these workshops within the company. There's always a slice of them who want to dive even deeper. And again, who are so moved by this work and by the skills that they have been taught that they want to be able to teach these skills within communities of their choice, beyond the workplace. So religious congregations, sports teams, civic movements that they're a part of. And so we've created a certification program where they can take an online course, also called Diversity Without Division, that they can take an online course that teaches individuals how to teach this work to others. And then that's not what certifies them. That just gives them the basic skills of teaching this work beyond the workplace. What certifies them is that we have an academic partnership with Oxford University. I happen to teach within an Oxford program called the Initiative for Global Ethics and Human Rights. And they are our academic partner. Starting next year, they will be accrediting, certifying individuals to actually teach this work beyond the workplace, and in the case of K-12 teachers, beyond their own schools. Because ultimately, Moral Courage College is in the business of changing culture, right? Again, going back to the very beginning of our conversation today, we live increasingly in an us against them paradigm. And we're interested in changing that paradigm. That paradigm is based on either or thinking. Either you're a Democrat or you're evil. Either you're a Republican or you're evil. And we're saying, no, it doesn't work that way. We human beings are much more complex than that. So replace the either or paradigm with the both and paradigm. On balance, Doug, I still think I'm right, but you make some good points. I can both be right from my perspective, and you make some good points, right? So this is culture change that we are advocating and equipping people to make outside of their specific institutions.
So we've got time for one more question. You've got a busy schedule, and then we've got rapid fire questions. I think that the one I want to ask is directly for our students who'll be watching this. There's a lot of research on the importance of psychological safety as a leader. There's a great published paper recently that showed, it reviews the literature on psychological safety. It shows its effects. It shows how it produces those effects, and it notes that we know very little about how we actually manifest it. And we always talk about with our students, it matters less that you know what psychological safety is than if you can, in that moment, in that encounter, in that meeting, start to create it. What are the lessons you'd have for leaders on how you build psychological safety in the moment?
Great. So psychological safety is one of those buzz phrases that, because it's so popular, has been corrupted. And a lot of people, when they bandy around the phrase psychological safety, think that it means, Doug, you can't say anything that I'll find offensive, because then I feel psychologically unsafe. And I'm calling BS on that, okay? That is not what psychological safety is. Psychological safety means that when we are bandying around ideas, when we are exploring different ways of seeing a particular issue, even if I find your intervention, your input, your opinion offensive, I'm not going to immediately judge you for it. Instead, I'm going to ask sincere questions about it, all right? And that way, I clarify where you're coming from, and you might clarify whether you actually believe what you have just said. And ultimately, as in any brainstorm, we can't be censoring one another, right? Because often, not even sometimes, often, the best ideas come from the fringe. And that means that I can't make you feel afraid, let's say, as a white guy, to speak your mind. I've got to be willing to listen sincerely, listen authentically, and only then decide if what you're saying makes some sense. But I first have to listen. That is psychological safety.
That's great. That's great. So we're going to end with some rapid fire questions. And these are one word kind of answers.
You think I'm capable of that?
I think you are.
We didn't get to talk about Lily.
You are.
We didn't get to talk about Lily. You're
Yes.
young, so read the book and find out about Lily.
Are you ready to go?
Ready as I'll ever
Okay.
be.
Your favorite leader?
Oh my God.
You're not the only one that you're not the only one that pauses on this one.
I'm gonna come up with so many more answers after this, but MLK, but not for the obvious cliche reasons.
Okay.
MLK, because he approached the world from a both and perspective. He said, America has the potential to be better, and as an American, it is my responsibility to help America become better. I love this country, and I love how it can improve. So it wasn't about saying no to America because of racism. It was about saying yes to America because of the need for an ever-perfecting union. Both and.
Okay. Rapid fire. Courage or compassion?
Compassion requires courage, so courage.
Courage. Speed or accuracy?
Accuracy, always and twice on Sundays.
Okay. Great ideas or great execution?
Great execution 101 times over.
A word to describe your leadership style?
I'd like to believe it's brave.
A night owl or early bird?
Oh, me? Definitely night owl.
Night owl, okay. Favorite book?
Besides my own?
Yes, yes.
One of my favorite books is, oh my God, there are so many of them. I'm going to take a pass and come back to it.
Okay. Your favorite label?
Plural.
Okay.
Plural.
You're going to be in a dangerous jungle. A podcast called The Jungle. It's a difficult, unknown task facing you. Who do you bring with you?
A project manager.
Okay. And if you had an animal that really reflected your leadership, what would that animal be?
A dog. A dog because dogs, like human beings, are individuals in their own right. And the dog with whom I have my conversation in Don't Label Me, even though she was old and blind, my dog named Lily, those labels completely defied what she was actually about. She was sassy and feisty and independent-minded, and she taught me so much. And so I would say a self-respecting dog who knows that she has the power to manipulate me more than I have the power to manipulate her.
That's all dogs, isn't it?
Exactly.
We got Lily in the.
Hence,
we got Lily.
self-respecting.
What is? Do you want to give? Is Lily a mixed breed or is she?
She was a mixed breed. She unfortunately passed away.
Oh,
but
sorry to hear that.
thank you. She was a rescue who was Havanese and something else, and we never knew what that something else was. And that was, of course, part of her mystery.
And if people want to learn more about your work and your book, you give a little plug of what they should read and where they should go.
Come to moralcourage.com. One thing I know I did not answer your question about favorite book. Look, I will tell you that when I moved from Hawaii, which is where I used to live, to New York, I spent the vast majority of my moving budget on my books. I wasn't willing to leave behind a single one of my books. And that's why. It's not that I can't answer your question, it's that I won't answer your question, because it compels me to reduce human creativity and knowledge and wisdom to one set of pages. And there's far too much of it to be reductive.
That's great.
That's a good answer.
So, Irshad Manji, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for coming to Western.
And thank you for letting me be your first guest
Absolutely.
in the new studio.
First in-person guest, new studio. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.